Yeah, welcome back to the special lecture series on the Korean Wave, who are K-pop fans in Europe, fandom, fan activism, and subculture. This program is organized by the Korea Europe Center at the Free University of Berlin and sponsored by the KDI School of Public Policy and Management. My name is Ju So-young at the Institute of Korean Studies at FU Berlin, and I'm hosting this talk series. And as an announcement, as usual, I would like to inform you that we are recording this talk to make it available online. Today is our fourth session with this topic: fan entrepreneurship, fandom, agency, and marketing of Hallyu in Israel. And today's speaker is Dr. Irina Lyan. And I think this is a quite rare opportunity for us here in Germany to get to know about Hallyu in Israel. And I'm quite happy to have Dr. Lyan for this. Dr. Irina Lyan is assistant professor and the chair of Korean studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel. She's also a recipient of many scholarships and awards, including research fellowships here at the Free University of Berlin and the University of Oxford and Yonsei University in Seoul. Her research includes South Korea's economic miracle, known as the miracle on the Han River, and the cultural miracle, which is known as the Korean Wave or Hallyu. Dr. Lyan has published many articles and book chapters on national image, imaginary, and imagination of Korea. So welcome, Dr. Irina Lyan. And now, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and invitation. I'm actually not sure if Israel can be considered as a part of Europe, but anyway, I'm glad to be here. So let me share my screen. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about fan entrepreneurship. It's a paper, a published paper that, together with Professor Nisimat Mazgin, and I'll be partially based on it. So before I talk about fans in Israel, I would like to ask a bigger question. Who are the fans in general? And as you could see, there are many definitions, and all of them have some kind of fault, which is interesting to explore. So first of all, if you go to Google and just put images and look for fans, you will see not one fan, but actually fans in plural. You will see crowds, nothing personal, and I think it's a part of problem in fandom studies. We usually see them as a kind of collective community, right? And I took these two examples from books on Hallyu. It usually, I collect cover of the books on Hallyu to see what we put. Usually we put down K-pop stars or cinema or TV drama, and very rarely, sometimes we put also fans, which is super interesting. Of course, this idea of community is very common, right? We can see Korean fans also called Korean tribes, like fandom tribes. We know about JYJ Republic, and of course we know about ARMY, the BTS fandom club. So it's really nice, but we can't actually know who are the fans because we don't see their faces, right? Like lack their individuality. So if you go to etymological analysis, I think it's quite interesting. So this is a definition from dictionary. Fan is generally and very likely correctly believed to be a shortened form of fanatic. The origin of fanatic, which can be traced back to the Latin word fanum, meaning sanctuary temple, is less often commented on. So I find this definition quite striking because, of course, we know a fanatic, and thanks to the presentation of my colleagues in last 3 days, we could see that fans usually, not only in K-pop and not only in K-drama, are usually perceived in a negative way, right? So there is some kind of connection between fan and fanatic. But the connection between fan and fandom is less discussed. And actually, in interviews that I collected with fans of Korean popular culture, both Jewish Israeli and Arab Israelis, many of them would mention a very interesting metaphor, the metaphor of refuge. The most striking example is that of the Palestinian fan that said to us that every time she hears bombings near her house, she puts K-pop songs on full volume and try to run away in some kind of imagined world or universe. So the theme of refuge, it's something very common I could see in personal meetings with fans. And again, it brings another problem in fandom studies. They don't know who are the fans because most of them consume Korean popular culture or other cultures privately behind the closed doors. Most of them don't announce on social media that they're fans of something. And one of the reasons is a negative perception of fandom. And therefore, we can only see active fans, only those who actually active on in public sphere. Okay, so let's see how fandom is defined in academic literature. So here we can see some kind of different definitions, but all of them are related to consumption. For example, to differentiate fans from consumers, fans are often viewed as fanatics, barbarian, lunatics, and other cultural dopes in Garfunkel language. And again, aliens. If you think about Japanese popular culture, it's of course otaku. In Korean popular culture, it might be Koreaboo. And it's very common view, especially in media, but also in academic studies, sometimes we can see this, oh, this is strange people, and this is how we should study about them. Another definition, which is a little bit more sensitive, is to talk about fandom or fans as dedicated consumers. They are maybe exaggerated, they might be grotesque, devoted, and of course this definition defines a normal consumer. The line between consumer and fan actually discussed well in academic literature, and it's a very difficult line to draw because there are so many similarities, right? Both consume, and usually what I do in my studies, I ask if the person defines him or herself, usually herself, as a fan. Finally, I think Professor Farh mentioned it yesterday, Jenkins' study about prosumers, producers and consumers as fans, which are cultural agents that co-create and even co-compete with cultural industries. For example, fans that become idols or celebs themselves in the local communities. That would be a great example. And again, it was mentioned yesterday. Okay, I understand why fan and consumer seems to be similar, but in general, I think it's very misleading. Why it's misleading? Because consumption is connected or associated with free time, with leisure time. I hope you all know about this cartoon, or maybe it's only for parents who saw and shared it. But when we think about consumption, fandom included, we think about some kind of leisure activity, something that we can do after our working time. And that's why, for example, some of us may feel guilty if we saw Korean TV drama all night, like I do sometimes. Yeah, because it's not supposed to be given. It's something we need to deserve after hard working. And of course, it's about social construction of time, work, leisure, something different. And why I found this problematic? Because as Professor Lee mentioned in her first lecture, fandom, it's actually a very much economic activity. So if you look at it only as a leisure free time, we dismiss this economic aspect of fandom. That's why, together with Professor Nisrat Margin, we came to another term, a different definition of fans, K-Farm as a cultural entrepreneurship. We defined it as a bottom-up localization of Hallyu by fans through new business and social opportunities by targeting fan communities' needs and desires. And in this view, fan can be defined as an economic agent of cultural exchange. By economic, by the way, I don't mean money, right? It can be monetized, but usually we see fans that receive very little or non money at all. And we can see fans who actually put their own money in some kind of enterprise. So economic means some kind of profit, and each fan defines its profit by him or herself. And again, I don't think it's a full definition, but at least it combines with cultural and business. And I'm sure you all heard about social businesses. And as you might know, it's not a simple combination between two, right? When we put social and business together, actually there are a lot of kind of things that might become complicated. Same with cultural business. It's not just a business that promotes culture, it's a little bit more than it. And I hope I can demonstrate it to you by several examples. So after I try to define who is a fan, I'd like to move to what fans do, or fan agency, if they're agents, how they express their fandom. So basically, in paper we wrote, we decided upon three main categories. I'm sure we can think about more categories, but these like the biggest ones. First is business, as we do any business activity. Second is education, and the third one is a social work, social political involvement. Each of them can be, of course, overlap, but again, with some kind of analytical distinction that might help us to understand fans a little bit better. So in business opportunity, I tried to bring some kind of contextual example of something that's very unique to Israel. And of course, it's a food, right? If we think about cultural translation of Hallyu to the Israeli context, one of the things that is difficult to achieve is actually tasting this cultural experience, right? And one of them is food. And the problem is kosher laws, religious laws of what you can eat and what you can't. And I think the only kosher restaurant in the world, you can find it at the old city of Jerusalem, that have actually kosher certificate. And it allowed many fans to actually taste this food. And I don't talk about only religious fans, because many secular Israelis keep kosher food as well. And another example can be travel. And of course, similar to European experience, Korea is very distant, not only geographically, but also mentally. And I called it a symbolic pilgrimage, is another paper, right, from Holy Land to Hallyu Land, and in which through consumption of K-pop, and especially of Korean TV drama, fans can travel and even to become a pilgrims to the place of aesthetic place of beautiful people and views. And today, in the age of COVID-19, I think it's very easy to imagine this cyber tourism, like we consume different places from a chair at home. But even before the pandemic, we could see people doing it through with the help of internet. So my most favorite example is that of religious tours for women to Korea. And I find it extremely interesting, because In this case, actual religion meets cultural religion. That's how some academics define fandom, and I'm pretty curious how does it happen. I did interview several fans who are religious, and I find this connection fascinating. And this is something that is very special for Israeli case study, because a significant part of fans that we could identify come from religious background. Okay, I put here another study who work on the same subject by Cedar Borseji about K-pop adjacent industries. Dr. Sergi, for example, identified 11 kinds of agents, economic agents, who can establish business and work on it. So I find that it very interesting, your categorization. But again, we went only to 3 categories to see a big picture of economic activity in fandom. My second example is, of course, education. And thanks to my colleagues, we already know it's a big thing in Korean studies. Suddenly we see an increase in the number of students. And what you see in the picture, I think it's quite an interesting encounter. You see a Korean Christian student, and both Jewish and Muslim pupils. The student basically received a scholarship for the peace project, another big interest in Israel if we talk about contextual characteristics that define Israeli Hallyu fandom. And she basically decided why not to put people who like Korean popular culture in one room, even if it's a conflictual group, and teach them Korean. And I'm sure you all know about soft power and some kind of promises to make peace in the Middle East by Hallyu, or to make peace between North Korea and South Korea, or between Japan and South Korea. So we're still looking for these promises to come to the to reality. But meanwhile, we see this interest. We see fans studying by themselves. We see fans coming to learn to Korean studies, to have a degree in Korean studies, which is amazing. And I remember Professor Lyan the first day asked what's going to happen in 10 years, right? So I have a small prediction, and let's see if I'm right. I think many of the professors of Korean studies are going to be fans, or maybe ex-fans, because we already see several MA and PhD students that continue in Korean studies initiated by popular culture, which is really amazing. And I think the biggest question is why fans do it, right? So in business activity, we can speak about like monetization, or you know, if I like my job, I never work in my whole life, etc. But in education, like teaching others Korean, establishing workshop on Korean lectures, or teaching others how to do kimchi, etc. I have some kind of explanation which I still have to investigate, but I often see that fans complain about the environments. For example, when they tell people, their family, their friends, that they like Korea, or they like K-pop, they often ask, they often question, oh, what is it? Where is it? Why do you like this? And what about North Korea, right? All kinds of questions that put on them pressure to actually to become experts of Korean popular culture, and sometimes expert of Korea. Like they need to prove something, they need to tell something back. So that might explain this expertization process by K-pop fandoms. And again, we can see that it doesn't happen that much. If you think about the Hallyu fandom in Israel, we can think about 10,000 people, maybe more. We can count, as I told you, most fans are not that visible. We have 50 people in our department, which is the biggest department for which where you can study Korean studies. And you can see that in proportion, we can talk about really small numbers that actually come and do academic degree in this. So most of fans do it by themselves or go to other funds and study from them. Again, it's something that was noted everywhere. We can see it in the United States, we can see it in Europe and other places, a big interest in Korean studies, but we still think to understand why it's happening, right? Why suddenly K-pop fans study Korean and are interested in Korean history. Of course, we can talk about it as, why not? It's such a good activity. But we also know that in other kind of fandoms, it doesn't happen necessarily. Yes, think about Harry Potter fandom, and I don't think all of them are suddenly interested in English history. Okay, the third activity is that of social activism, and elsewhere I called it from diasporic to fan nationalism, and I will read the citation. Please pass on a message to all Koreans in South Korea about how many people love them and their culture here in Israel. Let them know how much love we have for them, and let Israelis know that they are Koreans and they are amazing. Right, so here you see some call that was left for me in one of the surveys we run on social media. And what I found super interesting is that in past, in 80s and even in 90s, the people who promoted Korean culture abroad were most diasporic Koreans. Just I'm one of them, so I a little bit know this community, right? Who would organize Korea Days, for example, or Korean cultural activities? Usually Koreans who lived abroad and try to not only promote it outside, but actually keep it for their children and for their families, right? And suddenly we see this mushrooming of Korea Days, and in some cases Korea Weeks and other events. And again, my colleagues already mentioned some of them. They're usually sponsored by Korean cultural centers, by Korean embassies, but main organizers and main audiences are coming from Korean K-pop fans. I put here a small promotion of the Hebrew University. I could find several posters only with English, but just imagine if I could make a search with different languages. I'm sure I could find many more. This is my favorite poster because it says Korean Pavilion as a part of Global Day at the University of Sharia. So basically, thanks to Fandom, Korea Day has become a global day, which is celebrated and promoted by K-pop fans or Korean TV drama fans. Again, we see some kind of change, and that's why I called fans as agents of change. And as with education, as with business activities, we should ask why. I did it with my research assistant who interviewed our students in Korean studies program. About 90% of them decided to study Korean studies because of popular culture. And what I found was surprising, I think. Basically, they talked about stigma that they encounter as students of Korean studies. They encounter at home, they encountered by other students from other departments, like why Korea and why not China and Japan? Or are you again with these Asians? So some of these reactions are pretty racist. And Career Day, for many of them, is some kind of stigma management, some kind of stage where you can change the image about themselves, promote career, and say, yeah, it's an interesting subject that you can learn about, not just popular culture, not just Gangnam Style or BTS. And again, like these reasons, when we talk with fans, when we ask them, and when we encounter them, I think we can find some deeper reasons why we do what we do besides just, consumption. Okay, so to conclude, I propose something radical, to move from the language, who are the fans in the place X, to the question of fandom and action, right? So somehow most of studies of Hallyu fandom have some kind of geographical logic, right? What is K-pop fandom in place X, Y, and Z, and how fans in Germany are different from fans in Israel, right? So I think it's a great beginning to understand, for example, similarities and contextual difference between different fan communities. But what I think we should do actually to transform this question, like what our case studies actually tell about fandom studies in general, not just fandom of Korean popular culture, but fandom, because we can see some striking similarities between different kinds of fandom. And we can take the idea from Roland Barthes on his Death of the Alpha, right? You should put more attention to the message rather to the messenger. And when I think about this very radical idea, I think about two metaphors of popular culture. One is that of popular culture as a language we share and we can talk about. And that's why, for example, Israeli and Arabic fans can meet and, talk about popular culture in some kind of neutral way. And another metaphor, and apologize because we are amidst a pandemic, is that about virus. Sometimes fans talk about, oh, it's my friend who infected me, right, with this Japanese popular culture. And after that, I became a fan of Korean popular culture. So this viral nature of popular culture in general, not only of Korean, we can see that fans are some kind of transmitters, some kind of brokers, actors, and in some cases, even cultural ambassadors of Korean popular culture, and in some cases also of Korea in the world. And if we move our focus from fans to fandom in action, we can actually see it's just a little puzzle of much bigger picture of what who are the fans in place X. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much for your very interesting talk about this fan entrepreneurship, and also you in the end suggested the ways to promote the Korean culture and intercultural understanding by using this fandom as an instrument. I think that's a quite valid point. So now for the audience, this is your turn. So you can raise your hand by using the chat function, or of course you can send us your questions as well. So let me see. Then I think I would start with one question about, I mean, I am quite interested in these possibilities for social enterprises by using this fandom. And given that that majority of fans are women and rather young ladies, so I wonder whether this fan entrepreneurship can be a tool to improve women's economic participation and also female entrepreneurship. So connecting this fan network and their this fan experience and also with the social goal of promoting women's participation as part of the social entrepreneurship. So, do you think that in Israel, would you observe some possibilities, or are there some discussions like that?
Thank you very much for your questions. First of all, for your comment about potential of this fund to promote Korea abroad, right? I think this potential was already identified by embassies and by the Korean government, and actually they cooperate quite often. So it's not only funds by themselves, but it's usually funds who work with other institutions, funds that establish their own enterprises or associations or even NGOs. So again, I think it's some kind of a symbiotic even relations, we can call it. About gender aspect, I absolutely agree with you. I even didn't mention it because it was so clear for me that most of K-pop fans in Israel are young women, just like everywhere. It's a very much gendered fandom, and that's why, by the way, it's perceived more in a negative way in relation to male fandoms like sport fandoms or even video gaming fandoms. And if I look at social enterprises, yes, most of them are women who promote Korean cultural experience related or unrelated to popular culture. And many of them, actually not only entrepreneurs, talk about cultural empowerment, right? They could be empowerment only by this feeling of togetherness as a part of online communities, right? Something that could be very anonymous, but can be also very private and social. And of course, I see this kind of, let's say, institutionalization of fandom in some kind of businesses or initiatives, so ideas, as another step in this empowerment. So yeah, we can see women who are very active and actually can make a living from what we do, and that's amazing. And another thing about, and we talk about it again in last 2 days about marginality, right? We often see that actually many fans of K-pop are marginalized in social ways. So women is a part of this marginality. But if you look inside, for example, we often see that these are women of color, or these are women who don't come from rich families, or these are women who come from religious families, or they come from the periphery of Israel. For example, in Arabic case, we can see that most of them are don't come from Jerusalem, but they come from the periphery, from Arabic villages. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's quite fascinating to observe abroad that how K-pop is perceived as an instrument of multiculturalism and providing alternatives to social minorities in the countries. I don't know whether these Koreans were aware of that initially, or K-pop, these creators and producers meant that, but I think you could observe some positive externalities out of these scenes. I guess we have been discussing these matters, this gender, class, and ethnicity and minority, the connotations related to K-pop. So I guess some of audience would have some insightful remarks or questions. Then it would be nice to share with us.
Yeah, hello. Thank you so much for your very, very interesting talk. Actually, I also studied for some time in Israel, and I met Christian Korean studies. So, and then somehow this is how my interest in Korea also emerged. So I very much liked your report today. I'm actually also still interested in this. You called it like the stigma that the students try to overcome here. And actually, I would like to know what do you think? What is the appeal actually then in K-pop or in Korea or of this? Is it also, this is something that I always thought, that Korea is at least well depicted or thought of as very different, perhaps a very different place, a place that you can have fantasies on, that you can imagine as something very positive and so on. And yeah, so this is my question on what your perspective is here.
Thank you so much. It's such a good question. And I think to answer to it, I have to back to this million times asked question: what's K in K-pop, right? Or what's K in K-drama? What's attract K fans to this kind of popular culture? And in my view, K is not Korea, but actually K stands for marginality, right? So if you talk about stigma, there's some kind of connection why some people would be connected to marginal experience. And such marginality can be divided at least in 3 subcategories. Somehow I like the number 3, so everything should have 3 subcategories. One is gender. We already mentioned it. It's a gendered fandom, and we already know that female fandoms suffer from worse perceptions rather than male fandom. Another thing, it comes from the nature of popular culture, right? Because I talk mostly about K-pop and TV drama, which are considered to be in hierarchy of fandom on the bottom. And it's different, for example, for Korean cinema. If somebody will tell you, I'm a fan of Korean cinema, probably stigma is not a question here, right? It's another story. And I would connect it more to Professor Lee lecture on aristocrats. But yeah, I'm a fan of Japanese art, right? It sounds much better. And the final marginalization comes from Korea. And the discussion yesterday actually helped me to understand that if Korea is perceived in such a marginal and stigmatized way, like a connection to North Korea or to conflict, it's probably another thing that brings these fans to some kind of distant place, right? Some kind of, as you told yourself, fantasies, or again, the symbolic pilgrimage, the place that you can disconnect from your own and, you know, like imagine it and connect to it. So in one of my presentation, I told something radical. So now when we are recorded, I don't believe I say it again. What about thinking about marginal fandom, marginal popular culture consumed by marginal fans? Like there is some kind of connection between their identity and the nature of the fandom. Again, I can't prove it. That's why I think we should be very careful by defining fans in some kind of zoological way, like this is a fans and this is a not, because most of them don't announce it. Most of them hide it, actually, like this kind of Fandom, Refuge, etc. And again, I'm not fan myself. Maybe in 10 years when we'll have scholars who study fans of popular culture will find something much more interesting. But most of my students are fans, and I can see this stigma management almost on a daily basis, right? How they react to being framed as popular culture fans, for example, right? So again, this is very sensitive theme, and I wish I will know answers, and probably will never know, right? So only we can do, we can look what we do and try to understand fandom's activities, let's say.
There is another question from our student, Gwendolyn. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed listening to it. I especially liked how you actually divided the group you're talking about into consumers and fans, and try to define each group and how they relate to each other. I also really thought just amazing how much you can actually think about what fans are and why they why they do what they do. And I have just a question in general, that you kind of while listening to the discussion that your answer to Hendrik's question, I just suddenly asked myself, who is actually a hegemonic group that kind of marginalizes these people? It's such a strange thing that if you think of it in gender terms, well, you could say, yeah, because they are women and somehow empowered. The general gist of it would be that the patriarchal culture just kind of wants to stop them from being too independent. From the other side, then you have this high culture and low culture dynamics. So it's not gendered, but you have of kind of intelligent people that know what the real culture is, that don't want the fans to enjoy the low culture and do not take up space and actual capital to further develop arts that are of lower quality. And then in the third category, right now I don't remember, but I think there would also be different like hegemonic groups we were talking about. So what is your thoughts on that? And is this actually something that really plays a role in your research? And is this something that may be interesting for further research?
Thank you. It's such a good question. You may remember this movie, super famous one, Bridget Jones, and in the last movie, I think the third one, there's a scene where she danced to the Gangnam Style, right? And Darcy comes to her and she asks, "Oh, you don't look like you like Gangnam Style." And he answers, "Oh, where's Gangnam? I've been there. What do you mean exactly?" Right? So this high society and low society, it's like in few seconds can be seen here. Right? The high society will never know what's Gangnam Style, right? Okay, who marginalized fans? It's a big question, and I'm embarrassed to say one of the groups that do it, academics, right? By studying fans, by saying what they do, we basically categorize and trying to make several assumptions. We are excited by them, right? It's some kind of interesting group that we should study, and not only in Korean fandom. And for example, I remember reading a book of academic fan of Latin America soap opera, and she would say that she read all these papers and she was so surprised to see how different people speak about her own fandom, right? So in last year, we can see the call of, they call it Aka-fanish, Aka-fan. Let's be both academics and fans and look from fan perspective onto fans. Let's not talk about them, but let's talk with them. And it's very different. So again, I'm looking for this 10 years to see these Korean studies scholars who were fans by themselves and actually know what they're studying. And 2 years ago, I remember myself going to BTS concert in London, and suddenly I understood that I studied fans for almost 10 years, and I don't know enough about them, right? I actually was hit 5 times with this shamanistic lamp, if you know what I'm talking, in case you're a BTS fan. Okay, another group, and again, academics who read our papers, right? Maybe some students who are devoted to this subject. Media is to blame. I already mentioned Bridget Jones, but of course, one of the researches I'd like to do is look at the representation of Korean popular culture inside Hollywood. And we have several examples. I don't know if you know some of them, for example, Lucifer or Batman, that use Korean popular culture to make a point what we think about Korean popular culture. That's quite interesting. And in media, it's a new research that I'm working right now. I called it shock and surprise. And when we read English media about, not only about fans, but in general about Korean popular culture, we see this fascination and exotification with this talented and strange other, right? So basically, it's very much Oriental discourse about, oh, you know, we're so talented and we're in some place in Korea. So yeah, media is to blame, or maybe not, because somebody reads this media and consumes it. So maybe we shouldn't blame the messenger, but blame the audience who actually able and accept some this kind of messages. Again, it's a work in project. So right now I only see this shock and surprise, for example, from the success of Parasites, and I see it as a problem, not as something good to think about. And again, I always see media like, oh, BTS, Blackpink, and Parasite, and of course Gangnam Style. But these are actually, they don't represent everything. Like these are one-time successes. They actually prove how marginal Korean popular culture. If you remember, just 1 year ago, when Parasite got 4 Oscars, the shock and surprise that came with it proved us how marginal Korean cinema in the world. If somebody can believe or can be surprised by that Korean movie can win such a prestigious award. Okay, I can continue forever, so I will stop here. Thank you.
All right, great. Yeah, but I'm wondering whether this marginalization, I mean, also Dr. Lyan, you mentioned that, I mean, it could be something actually from the supplier side, but suppliers' characteristics coming from a small, relatively unknown Asian country. But on the other hand, there could be from also consumer side, who are consumers in Israel or elsewhere. But then when we focus on K-pop itself, I mean, it's basically a youth culture, right? We talk about somebody around 18 or oldest, probably 20-something. But if we extend the Korean wave, not only then K-pop, but into other genres like these K-movies, there could be one thing, and also possibly literature or some other things that may also diversify these consumers groups that could also contribute to changing the images or status of this Korean pop culture in other countries. Yeah. Then do you think that these genres in Israel, I mean, is it heavily then K-pop dominant, or are there some other interest, especially from other demographic groups also existing?
Oh, it's again a good question, because as I told you, marginalization comes from kind of popular culture you consume, like tell me what you consume and I tell you who you are, kind of style assumptions. So yeah, in Israel it's K-pop dominated, heavily K-pop dominated, but we can see a change with Netflix, of course, not only in Israel, everywhere. Somehow Korean cinema and TV drama become more and more globalized, more popular. And still, this K doesn't disappear, right? It's like, I even think about A as a famous novel in scarlet letter A, like you have to wear it to show that you're different. And somehow we don't have A-pop culture, right? We have A-pop. We have J-pop, which is again sign of difference, or maybe sign of cultural marginality. I also can see the efforts of mostly of Korean government to diversify, like let's put Korean traditional culture, let's add Korean food, webtoons, movies. Again, like I also think that not all Koreans are happy that popular culture is what represents when abroad. Like we have some kind of ambivalent relations. both Koreans like in Korea and diasporic Koreans as well. And yeah, there is some kind of effort to diversify, to tell, no, Korea is more than popular culture. And I think it's very interesting effort. Like you should look at it and see what happened. And this education favor that we can see among K-pop fans may actually help it, and see how basically fans become experts in different spheres, including Korean history, right? And what else? No, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Fu, please go ahead.
Thank you, Irina, Lyan, for this great talk. I have a question on your last point, where you suggest that we have to somehow leave the geographical logics in the analysis. What we, of course, so far did in observing the effects of fandom in different localities, especially in Europe. And you more try to support these fandom in action. So I would just like you to elaborate a little bit more on maybe next to the cultural entrepreneurship, which we see in the international scope. So do you find any similar or any other findings? Because for me, it's not really a contradiction to looking at localities where fans are, of course, are these agents or actors, as you also suggested. And my second question somehow relates to it, because maybe you can tell us a little bit more on the relationship between the diasporic and the fan nationalism, because as you also observed that always the question on K, so it seems to be some kind of post-colonial reverberation of the situation of how popular music is produced, especially in East Asia, where it's very important to have this national signifier. And this, again, is maybe repeated in fandom, in the globalized fandom as well, where there's some kind of distinction between Israel and Korea or Germany and Korea. So why are we why do we find these discourses constantly framed within these kind of nationalistic paradigms? Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think it's a good question for 2 books at least, but I'll try to answer. So first of all, of course, I'm not the only one and not the first one to call to, let's say, destroy the hegemony of national discourse and national categories. We basically, even in this last 4 days, we already talked about so many categories through which we could analyze fandom, right? We talk about class, we talk about gender. Today, I tried to talk about religion, which is another category which is less discussed in fandom studies. Both religion as a metaphor to understand fandom, and both religion as a category of these fans. And somehow national category became a dominant one. There's a long explanation, how did it happen? But basically, I think about the call to move from transnational to transcultural, that can think about intertextuality and many different categories that didn't receive much academic attention. And let's think like 10 years ago, when so many scholars of Korean studies were like shocked and surprised by the success of Korean popular culture in Europe or in Israel, from all the places. I'm pretty sure it was a big surprise for many people. And I think that's what blinded us, the national thing. And what we did, mostly case study in place X, case study in place Y. And it was an important work, right? We collected some evidences, we found out that there are many similarities between what happens in Latin America and what happens in India, for example. But somehow it was another version of fan studies in specific location, right? So I think, again, I'm a sociologist, so maybe that's why I always think about like big picture and how can we contribute to big fandom studies, which, by the way, right now dominated by Western case studies, right? And this we know for sure, like they study popular culture, they study Hollywood, they study in American music. So somehow I think the next move is to to move away from this shock and surprise and move toward some kind of theoretical contribution. And regarding yours, okay, I hope I answered at least, but again, I see it as a kind of shift in fandom studies in general that tries to do it and say, let's talk more about gender, let's talk about religion, let's talk about age, right? We know that this usually used, but we also talk about middle age women who, for example, consume Korean TV drama. And again, it's another marginal group within gender category, and somehow is dismissed as well. Regarding diaspora, it was again my own personal experience that I tried to translate it to a paper. I have time? Yeah, I have time. So basically, in one of the career days we organized at the Hebrew University, I came to one of the booths, like that students organized, and she told me, it's so fun. I'm sitting in the tourism booth, but I've never been in Korea, right? So like I have to explain to all other fans who came to visit this Korea week or Korea day, I don't remember, but basically she'd never been there. And suddenly I'm like 5th generation diasporic Korean. Suddenly I understand it's very close to diasporic experience, because many of us look like Korean, but never been to Korea or have like distanced from Korea. And that's how this article was born, like to look at this diasporic nationalism, like Koreans abroad who try to promote Korean culture. Not everyone does it. And the fans who do the same, by example, by organizing and promoting Korea, or arguing on Facebook, like what's happened during the colonial period. This, I've seen it by myself, like students who say, I studied in the course, so I know, again, this expertization and who knows better thing. So basically, when we look on studies on diasporic nationalism, it's considered to be a paradoxical term. Like, if you're nationalist, you have to be inside the territory, like you have to be born in Korea or in other place. You can promote it only if you are like true Korean. And I think diasporic experience is very similar to fan experience, right? We don't have this national how to say, prove that we can promote another country rather than their own, but we still do it, and we do it pretty successfully, right? We can see them on all events, both as audiences, both as organizers, and they kind of sometimes dismissed. I think about the paper about Frankfurt Korea Day, Korea Project. It was published 2 years ago, and it was some kind of dynamics between Korean diaspora in Frankfurt and Korean students who are, for example, organized K-pop party, right? And of course the local Korean embassy who had this kind of agreement or disagreement how K-Day project should look like, right? So I find this discussion on nationalism and fandom, like to put them together. Again, it might be explosive and super sensitive, but my fans, in my interviews, for example, I could see fans using the word asbara. Asbara, it's a Hebrew word that means explanation, and we use it in very specific context, like to explain Israel to the world and say that Israel is a great place to live. So they told me, yeah, we do asbara to Korea. Basically, they feel obliged to promote Korea because people don't know it. And then I ask them why. We find that it's a part of their identity, right? So basically, the stigma management is not about Korea, it's actually about themselves. Again, I think there are even more connection there between diaspora and fandom, just as between religion and fandom, and that's something we can contribute if we forget about national locations and geographic context. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. There is one more question from Rajo. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Kevin. I'm from Stockholm University in Korean Studies. First of all, I want to thank you very much, Irina, Lyan, for your exceptional presentation. It's really interesting to hear your perspective in Israel, being here in Sweden myself. I was very interested about the comparison between the breakthrough of Korean popular culture comparing Europe and the Middle East, especially as I was introduced to the Korean popular culture through Middle Eastern friends who live in Sweden, actually. A few years ago, maybe, what can it be, 8 years ago or something like that, Korean popular culture was not very widespread in Sweden yet, but actually I have some Middle Eastern friends who introduced me to Korea. So I was wondering why was Korean popular culture so early to break through in the Middle East? And also I have noticed generational differences that the parents of my friends also consume a lot of Korean culture, such as dramas. And I also noticed that Korean dramas are dubbed to various Middle Eastern countries' languages, such as Arabic and Syrian and so forth. So I was wondering how you see on this difference between Europe and Middle East and the breakthrough of the Korean popular culture. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this excellent question. You were introduced to Korean culture for your friends from Middle East in Sweden. I think this what Arjuna Padwa would call transnational irony. And again, I think proves my point that we should remove this geographical logic and think about like in more transcultural way, yeah, because people move all the time and somehow we can come to Korean popular culture in such a different and distinct place. And you already answered your question in at least partially when you mentioned language. Of course, Middle Eastern languages, we mostly talk about Arabic, but not always. And in Israel, we can see Arabic fans who basically have different routes to get know about Korea. Like we have Arabic routes, whereas in Israel we have mostly English routes and a little bit Hebrew. So it's a huge problem because Hebrew is not main language for the Korean government to translate into. So this is the second part of the language. Of course, Korean government puts Middle East as one of the markets, if we talk about in economic language, for many reasons. It's like export industry. In general, Korean popular culture appeared a little bit before, but I mean governmental investment in popular culture appeared before the Asian crisis. And actually after the crisis, it was said, yeah, we should diversify, not only automobiles and phones, yeah, let's also put some money in movies and other things. So I find it very interesting. It was first economic reasoning, and only later it was like social, cultural diplomacy, political reasons. Let's make peace in the Middle East as well. And third reason, it's again, you mentioned generations, and of course, I think about a case study in Iran where Korean TV dramas, historical TV dramas without any sexual scenes actually got through the censorship of the local government, and you can consume them and they're of good quality. So it's something that of course contributed, right? If we think historically how Korean TV drama came to the Middle East, We can see again the help of the Korean government who translated it. Again, the language, cultural translation and actual translation is so important. And I think the first one was Egypt, and we didn't expect such a big success. Like it was like, let's diversify, let's try, and it was a big hit. I mentioned religion, so let's talk about religion, because many fans talk about that religiously it fits their beliefs, their values, their norms. It's something that's not that sexual, so sometimes it's family activity that people can watch it together, and it's not. It's really important. Like we can see it, and we can see a clear connection to religion. I think there is one more. There are a lot, of course, of many factors that contributed, and again, I think we should enter the head of Korean government to see like the map of Hallyu, where should we invest and where we should not. For example, Israel doesn't appear on this map. Like we do have some kind of investment, but we're so small and we are in conflict with half of the world. So it's much more safer to invest in the Middle East, with whom South Korea has good relationship, or in Europe, or in the United States, right? So again, there are like economic, political, cultural reasons that, and religious ones that can explain this success. And I think about I'm thinking about this modesty thing, because it's always mentioned like how modest are K-pop stars, how modest is Korean TV dramas, but I think there's another political aspect in this, because after 9/11, I think many people in the Middle East felt that they can't consume American popular culture, which is basically sometimes the only option or the biggest option. So somehow the Korean wave came in a good time, in the right place and good time, like to propose a good enough alternative to this Hollywood. So yeah, I don't think only about this. It's not always modest and religious appropriate, but politically, I think there are a lot of reasons. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for a very diversified and a complex answer to my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think her questions were quite all, in depth, and then of course the answers, very insightful and informative. And are there any further questions from the audience? If not, then I would like to thank you again, Dr. Irina Lyan, for your excellent talk. I mean, once again, this is a quite, exceptional occasion. We get to know about Hallyu in Israel. In my understanding, this is somehow bridging country between Europe and the Middle East. So probably you represent both sides. So it's a small country, but somehow, representing, two part of the Eurasia. So yeah, very interesting. And I would like to thank you to the presenter and then also audience for your all discussions and questions. And we then close our session for today. Have a nice evening, everyone, and see you tomorrow.